we are going to take a few minutes tonight and talk about the biennium budget update and how it relates to public school funding for public schools across Ohio and here in Wyoming. And it's important that we recognize that this is the information that is available today, 8/20, April 21st. Things are moving fast, changing fast. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that have already changed and what we might expect to see in the next few weeks. So why are we even talking about the biennium budget? The state budget's in 2-year cycles, and we're wrapping up a biennium budget and getting ready to move to the next one. So you'll see it some different dates in here. I'll try to just make sure I talk about when we reference things that are happening this year, fiscal year 25. We're wrapping up fiscal year 25, and then moving into next year, 26 and 27. So really, that's all we have. When we think about our revenue projections on our 5-year forecast, really all we have from the state are what we know to be law in the next biennium budget. But as we're going to learn tonight, some of the proposals in this year's biennium budget impact some of our other revenue categories. And just sort of a quick refresher here, we have 3 material revenue sources in our general fund. Our most material revenue source is real estate taxes. That's where we get most of our general fund revenue at 41%. Second is income tax at 31% and state funding at 20%. So we are talking about a $5.5 million revenue source here in the district. And we have been flatlined. Our state funding has been flatlined since fiscal year 19. So we're on a 6-year run of seeing no increase every year in state funding. And at least in the recent biennium and the 2 recent bienniums was the implementation of a new formula. So the new Fair School Funding Plan. But here in Wyoming, I think we say that it's not fair or funded because we've been on this flat line since fiscal year 19. So the planned phase 3, we've been through phases 1 and 2, but again, immaterial in Wyoming because none of that has generated additional revenue for us. What was supposed to happen is that in this next biennium was the planned phase in of 3. It was supposed to be four phase ins. Okay, so what was supposed to happen is phase 3. And so we'll kind of get what's being proposed to happening. But again, just important for us to understand that we've been on the guarantee since prior to the Fair School Funding Plan at this kind of 5.9, 5.8 million. And again, just want to mention that in that same time span, spending toward vouchers increased from 346 million to almost $1 billion. So when we hear about the state not being able to fund some of these provisions, the state is able to find significant revenue to fund vouchers. So where are we in the process? This process started in February. Governor DeWine introduced his version, and we'll talk about the versions that we've seen. Then it moves to the House, and the House has a version. And then we get to the Senate, and the Senate has a version. And then we kind of have these 3 proposals out there, the governor's version, the House version, and the Senate's version. And then all those go to conference committee, and that will happen in June. And sometime between when conference committee, late May and June 30th, we have to have a budget. Ohio law requires that the governor sign the budget by June 30th. And in previous bienniums, there have been some years where there were extensions. But for the most part, we're going to start July 1st with a budget. And so, we've talked about different funding models. So this isn't Ohio's first rodeo with looking at different formulas. So I've been in school treasury financial leadership for 25 years, and I think I've been through somewhere between 8 and 10. I've honestly kind of lost track. And so DeRolf, was sort of generating some additional revenue early on in here. And we've been through some freezes, all different names, bridges, all different components. We've been through a number of scenarios. Public school funding in Ohio has had many, many different scenarios. But in 2017, there was a bipartisan collaborative effort that generated an input-based model that was the Fair School Funding Plan. Again, it generated additional revenue for 612 of the 612 public school districts in Ohio. It generated additional revenue for 600 of them. Only 11 of us were on the guarantee. So we were 1 out of 11 that was on the guarantee right out of the gate from the implementation of the Fair School Funding Model. And that our situation specifically was about this issue about capacity. So the Fair School Funding Plan was about inputs. We're going to look at real live data, what it costs to educate a kid, and we're going to do this research and dump it all in there. And then school funding has always been declared a shared responsibility in Ohio. So we got to figure out a way to measure of that what it costs to educate a kid, how much of that is the state share and how much of that is the local share. So there's this sort of capacity thing. And then there's some add-ons for special ed or students of poverty. But it's this capacity piece that has always kind of been a thorn in our side in the formula, because every capacity measure, Wyoming looks wealthy, whether it's income, whether it's property tax. We look very wealthy, and because of that capacity measure, we are not a school district that receives additional funds under the formula, okay? So when we think about, as fair as it may have been to the 600 of the 612, apparently not any school funding formula is perfect, because it really doesn't work for everybody, because there was just this little capacity thing that we just couldn't figure out a way to get new money to everybody. Okay, so that's kind of in the thorn.
But we didn't lose money.
We didn't lose money. They put us on the guarantee. Okay, and that's important.
And they could have come up with 11 separate plans. for us.
Yes, but it makes
But
it
they
difficult to
did
call it a model at that point.
Right.
By capacity, they mean we have the capacity to be okay without help. until
Yes.
They didn't give it.
Without
Yes.
more help.
Yes,
than we're
that's
getting.
exactly it. So, and that's a great way to put it. So we're gonna devise this formula. We're gonna say it costs this. And then there's this formula that of this main number, how much of each school district plugs itself into that calculation, and how much of that are you responsible for in your local district? And there are a number of capacity inputs into the capacity measure. It used to just be property tax, and then they added another layer of income tax, and as you might imagine, that didn't help us. Okay, so that didn't help the equation at all. We were almost better off with the property tax calculation. But so every single model up here, when you kind of look at the history of school funding, at least since the 90s, all of these have had a capacity measure. They were called different things, they look different, but every single formula had some version of a capacity measure in it. Okay. So what did the governor do? So, right out of the gate, he said, okay, well, in the defense of this, from the governor's perspective, was we can't afford the fair school funding plan. Now, remember, we shared before that we might debate that a bit, but, the answer was we can't really afford to continue implementing, continue the phase in, continue updating the inputs. And so it's important to just remember, though, that the fair school funding plan has inputs in a lot of different ways. So there's a way to update the inputs to talk about the cost. So let's update teacher salaries and benefits and inflation, cost of materials, the inflationary price of textbooks. We know those things have gone up, inflationary pressure on technology, utilities. All of those things go into calculating the cost to run a district. And of course, we know those costs have gone up, right? They didn't update those inputs, but they did update the inputs on the capacity calculation of how much we're required to pay. So what have property taxes done over this time, up or down? This is the there we go, up, good. What about income for the most part here in Wyoming? Up, and enrollment has statewide down. Here in Wyoming, yeah, we're a stable city here, right? I mean, we go like this, but we don't go like this, right? We look at our enrollment a lot of different ways. So when you update when you don't update the inputs, but you do update the capacity, the answer to that is obviously everyone is going to get less, because you're not increasing the cost. We're just increasing the amount of the cost you pay, so that no one is getting additional money. And you see that in the traditional public school. Those are red. That's bad. Red is bad, right? Okay.
It's intentionally complicated.
It's super complicated. Traditional public schools, and we're only on the governor's proposal. Okay, so the governor's proposal over the biennium, less money for traditional public schools. Okay, look whose numbers aren't red. Scholarships are vouchers. Okay, those numbers say 8.2 and 7.6. Okay, yes, traditional public schools are -0.4 and -0.5. Okay, negative 15.8% increase over the biennium. Okay, so there is some money somewhere for public education. There's clearly a decision. Yeah, there's clearly a decision about where it's being driven. Okay,
And I think it's important to mention too, every time, the number of students in public education is about 90% of Ohio.
90% of students in Ohio are served in Ohio's public schools. That is accurate. Okay. So. We talked a little bit about kind of the history of school funding. And so the governor, when we don't update the inputs, but we didn't pause, or we do update the capacity pieces. Of course, everybody got less. We saw that on the first chart. But the next piece of the governor's proposal, remember, we were on the guarantee, right, since fiscal year 19. The next piece of the governor's proposal was to reduce the guarantee calculations. So there were now, remember, we started at 11, right? Now there are 225 of us on the guarantee. And the governor's proposal had a reduction, a phase-in reduction, 5% in year 1 and 10% in year 2. And you put those reductions into kind of the fake model, I guess. And now you see that state share as a base cost is driven over this biennium on an average down to about 32% of the state share of base cost, okay? It was 42% when DeRolf was declared unconstitutional. So we are not moving in the right direction, okay? Currently, our state share in the calculation is 24.2. We're driven down in the governor's model to about 13. Okay, the state minimum is 10. You are not allowed to go below 10%. Okay, and some of our neighboring districts are there. Madeira is there, Marymount is there, Indian Hill is there. 10% minimum state share. Okay, so that's the governor's version. Couple other things happened, or a couple other points to just hit. Again, no updates and not updating the input. Did update the capacity measures, reduce the guarantee, 5% and then 10%, and that's about $850,000 in the biennium, so just over the next 2 years. But if I extrapolate that out over the life of the 5-year forecast, well, the impact is about $2.5 million for us. So this is not a small change. It may seem like this reduction in the guarantee is kind of a small thing. It isn't. If that was extrapolated out, and I have to assume in the forecast that we wouldn't be getting that money back, okay? And again, we've been on the guarantee since prior to the inception of the Fair School Funding Plan, and current year, 477 school districts in Ohio have a higher per pupil base cost than we do. So when you put all that data in, of the 600 plus, 477 of them get more state funding than we do in terms of base cost, so 78%. We're in the bottom quarter of the district.
Is that just a mistake that they updated capacity but not the other data inputs?
No.
Anybody want to take a guess?
Kind of asking that, like, where I know the answer, but
No,
it doesn't make
no.
any sense.
No.
Well,
Right.
it does, right? I mean,
Well, it does
I
because
mean,
it
it's-
generates money back to the taxpayers, which is one of their plans. They want to.
But Okay,
It
but
also
how do
funds the
you rationalize that? Like, if it,
How
like, that's not logical.
I don't think they care.
you say logic, you got that right.
Logical doesn't matter.
I don't know that logical is the answer. Okay, but we're still on the governor's plan, okay? So
Good
this is
question.
still the governor's plan. So that was all the governor's piece, all right? So the governor approved that, and then the whole entire thing went to the House, okay? So where are we on the timeline? We're done with the first row, okay? Now we go to the House. Okay, so we have the good, it's not great, but better, okay? Guarantee is maintained. Okay, so us and our 224 friends, the guarantees are maintained. There is a small increase for public school districts. Statewide, remember when we looked at that chart under the governor's plan and that line was red? At least now it's positive, a 1.2% in the first year and another 1% in the second year. And we are projected to have a small increase, okay? So remember, we've been on the guarantee for 6 years. We haven't seen an increase. So at least under the House's proposal, they have given us a little increase. They have done that because they have completely paused the Fair School Funding Plan. They said, that's really not working. So pause that. We're gonna kind of have this bridge. So not sure what, we're not sure what's coming next. But the bridge is maintain the guarantees, small increases for public schools in Ohio, small increase for Wyoming, okay? That's the good.
But, okay.
The bad is there's this cash balance provision. And this cash balance provision requires the county budget commission to reduce our property tax revenue if we have a cash balance that exceeds this 30% calculation. Okay, so they look at our cash balance when we close our fiscal year on June 30th. They look at our cash balance, and if that cash balance exceeds 30% of your expenditures, they will reduce our property tax revenue the following year. So if they don't like our cash balance, as determined by the amount of money that we spend, they will reduce our tax revenue. Okay? I'm gonna explain that in a second, so hang on. And then things we're kind of not sure about, moving from a 5-year forecast, so we do the 5-year forecast twice a year, to now a 3-year forecast. Not 100% sure what the end game of that is from the legislator's perspective. The 5-year forecast gives us a lot of good data and helps us plan. I think it helps our union leadership plan. I know that it helps us it helps us work collaboratively in our stewardship pillar. I think it's a good tool, and I think we've used it as a good tool. I don't know what the end game is in moving it to 3 years. So
Maybe
not sure.
less information for people to get worked up about when they see the losses over
Maybe,
time.
maybe. And then, the bridge formula, while we like all the components at the top, we don't know where we're bridging to. And, you know, I've always kind of been a believer that any formula is better than no formula, because when there's no formula, then you're subject to the whims of whatever is happening up at the State House. And that's difficult for us. So even, I think some formula, even if we're not on it, it is easier to forecast, right? So, so that's why I kind of put that down there in the not sure category. Okay. So let's learn a little more about the bad and what that means. So this cash balance provision requires the county budget commission to reduce tax revenue. Okay. This is the single largest property tax reduction measure since House Bill 920 in 1976. 1976, there was incredible inflation. Okay, so home values were rising, and the Ohio legislature said, all right, we got to do something about this. And so they adopted House Bill 920, which is the measure that I always talk about when I say that property values go up and the effective millage rate goes down, so that we collect about the same number of taxes. And remember, we have recent evidence of that when our values went up 29% and we only collected a 3% increase in property tax revenue. Okay. This House bill was unveiled and passed in a 10-day span. Okay, so the single largest property tax reduction measure since 1976 was introduced in the House and passed out of the House in less than 10 days. That's kind of a big deal. Okay. We began this fiscal year, the year that we're in, with a 33.41% cash balance. Okay, so remember, the target is 30%. We began this fiscal year. If this would have been in place, that would have resulted in the county budget commission requiring the county auditor to reduce our property tax by 1.16 mils, or about $530,000. Okay. This completely ignores the voters and the will of the voters in your school district. And in most cases, every time you pass a levy, I mean, we know that we're at the end of our levy cycle, and in the next few years, we're going to be back on the ballot for something, some operating levy. And so at 30%, the result is that the consequence of this is that immediately after we would pass that millage, we would be above 30% and it would be reduced. So the unintended or maybe intended consequence is that we would be on the ballot much more frequently. Because as soon as you collect millage, it's reduced. As soon as you collect it, it's reduced. As soon as you were kind of walking this tightrope of having enough cash balance to be able to operate your district. To the next point, cash balance is key to our financial stewardship. We've had a cash balance policy that was crafted many years ago, and we've crafted that policy because we know what our cash needs to be in order to meet our payroll, our benefit, our contract obligations. I mean, we have a very cyclical operation in terms of the school year, but that's not how our revenue comes in. So you have to have at least some level of cash balance to be able to meet your cash flow needs. And so we studied that at length and we adopted a cash balance policy. We've been using that cash balance policy and working towards our next operating levy. Okay. Again, and this would ignore all of that benchmark planning of local school districts. I mean, many districts across the state have cash balance policies that are specific to their needs. I mean, this is local control 101. What do we do that works for our school community? Okay. And so thinking about our current forecast, you know, I said we started the year at 33, but we're projected right now to end fiscal year 25 below 30. And so we know that we have been drawing down our cash, and we've been talking about this for a couple years. We've been drawing down our cash, pointing towards a new operating levy for collection in 2028. So running something in 27. But had we been reduced at the beginning of this fiscal year, it would have just accelerated all of that. It either accelerates your need for new revenue, or it accelerates your need to reduce expenditures. Neither of those are good, right? Because we've been working very hard since our last levy in 2017 to live in this cycle and be respectful of our taxpayers and try and stay off the ballot as long as possible. But all of a sudden, under this new provision, anytime that you achieve financial stewardship and have some savings, immediately penalized. Okay, so this is a really big deal. Okay. And so we have advocated and sent testimony. The legislature's on spring break this week. And so the House has passed this. This has happened. Okay. Oh gosh, I forgot one. I'm sorry. This last one is really important. Cash balance is a critical component of our bond rating. And we just issued bonds and went through that process for a new bond rating. We have a high rating, and a high rating, we know, drove down our interest rate, right? And that ends up being less interest paid by our taxpayers over the 37-year life of the debt. When we got our rating, a measure in the rating recommendation or the rating analysis from Moody's was that factors that could lead to an upgrade, have your cash balance at 50%. So it's required to go to AA1 or AAA, but no one in the state is ever going to get there because of this measure.
Right? They don't have.
Yeah, so, and that was really important because that one, I mean, we just did this. And this was deemed a strength of ours.
Right.
Is that one, we had a cash balance policy, and two, we had a healthy cash balance in relation to our levy cycle. So we've already moved across the top with the governors. We've moved through the House, and right now we're late April, early May. The Senate is holding, when they come back from legislative spring break, the Senate will be holding their hearings. We'll have additional opportunities to testify. We do not know what version the Senate is going to roll out, but my colleagues here in Hamilton County, public schools across Ohio have been heavily advocating that they pull out this 30%. I mean, it really is a problem. And I think the public education community is doing a good job of helping them understand why this is a really difficult situation for all of us. So the ask, when we think about what's happening, what could come out of the Senate, or when we see what comes out of the Senate, is that we want to protect the guarantee. Remember, we can't just rely on what came out of the House, because when it gets to conference committee, they're going to reconcile all three versions. Okay, they'll have the governor's version, they'll have the House version, and they'll have the Senate version. So really all three of those things and any measures in them, and then maybe something new could be in play. So we need to protect the guarantee. This 30% cash balance provision has got to go. Okay. And how about we think about some measure that increases state funding? So we've got to figure out some way, some realistic capacity calculation that actually does drive an increase in state revenue. I mean, if you think about it, it really isn't realistic that we've had flatline state funding for 6 years, which really, as Tim likes to point out, isn't really flatline. Because if you're staying flat when inflation is increasing, that's not flat. You're losing ground, right? So some measure that can have some sort of inflationary allocation in the capacity version of the formula. And so I feel like kind of a little bit like a broken record that we're kind of in wait and see, but we're still a little bit in wait and see. We need to see what the Senate comes out with, but this is our ask. And so when we see what comes out of the Senate, this is our message. And we'll be, continuing to work with our community groups and our parents to perhaps, depending on what the Senate version looks like, voice this ask.